we continue looking through the seven doorways to self-discovery that you're covering in your book, Internal Power: Seven Doorways to Self-Discovery, we come to number 2, which is communication. Now, this should be an interesting one. I mean, I'm taking it that you're not talking about whether we've got the latest cell phones, are you? You're talking about the way that we communicate with each other, and I think also within ourselves. I wonder whether you could just make a start with this, because it's a big subject, and I'd really like to just to invite you to take it away, please.
Well, communication, as we've been exploring self-discovery, and we just recently explored choice, and I mentioned there that the next understanding, as we begin to realize, our thoughts and feelings have powerful impact in our world, then being aware of the choice that we can choose different thoughts, we then need to really look at how this whole process of thoughts and feelings relates to communication, our communication, not only with ourselves, but the world around us. And interestingly enough, when I encountered and started writing about and putting together my thoughts and writing about communication, it was really clearly evident to me that communication is an incredibly important aspect of our lives, and yet very much misunderstood and misaligned, and really not contemplated and considered. In fact, if we actually look at, the greatest challenges in our life usually stem from a breakdown in communication. So my exploration of communication was really the next phase for my own self-discovery. As I began to pay attention inwardly with my thoughts and feelings, I started to realize that was a potent form of communication. Against the backdrop, in a way, from my business background, where I had been taught and shown, and through education and through cultural reasons, how our communication, how we communicate through marketing, how we communicate amongst each other, it was always an externalized version of communication. So I started to put together my thoughts about how the internal communication that we have, the inner dialogue we have, relates to our external communication. And if you take, again, this internal focus, we're moving from constantly focusing on the external world to more of an internal contemplation, and that our thoughts and feelings are actually potent sources of our external experiences, then it made sense to me to really develop a much deeper understanding of just how does communication work in our life. How do we communicate differently with ourselves, and then how do we communicate differently with the people around us? And if we can effectively have a better understanding of our inner communication, we will naturally improve our external communication. We improve our external communication, we're going to have easier and more fruitful experiences, which will again help us to have even a more positive inner dialogue and inner communication. So that, again, the circle of life that keeps coming up over and over again in all of our discussions. I think most people just simply are so externally focused and so active in some form of communication that they don't even bother to stop and pay attention to what is it they're saying, how are they acting physically, non-physically, much less even going within, which is where we bring in this whole self-discovery process of beginning to understand, or even our inner communication, as a way to begin to address communication in general.
So in what different ways do we communicate internally, would you say?
Well, in my exploration of communication, really wanting to understand the whole process of, it's one thing to be able to begin to focus on and notice, what kind of thoughts am I having? There was a whole nother level to begin to realize that there was this energy of feeling, and that came sometime after I started exploring my thoughts. Well, part of that internal, what was I thinking, and how was I thinking, and what kind of experiences was I then having externally? I also started to pay attention to how was I communicating with other people? What was I doing? What was I saying? What was my impact out in the world based on the types of thoughts and feelings I was having? So delving a little bit deeper into, well, what is the natural mechanism and process? At this particular stage in my life, I was beginning to notice that I just assumed everybody looked at life the way I did. Not so much as looking at the same things in the same ways. I just assumed that we all processed our information the same way. We're all human. We're all bipeds. We're all, more or less a smile is a smile and a cry is a cry and laugh is laughter. It had not occurred to me that we may in fact process information in our worlds differently. And in this exploration, I started to uncover this understanding that we are primarily one of three, with one being more dominant. We're either visual in our processing, auditory, or kinesthetic. Visual meaning we more or less absorb everything through what we see. Auditory is we absorb our experiences and our information through listening, by hearing. And then kinesthetic, we're more touchy-feely. We need to kind of connect with, our experiences in a more direct, tangible way in order to really have an experience with it. So again, as the self-discovery process unfolded, not only did I explore and contemplate and try to understand these processes, I also was then noticing more acutely the experiences with myself and with others. And this understanding of visual, auditory, kinesthetic really became a profound wake up in a way to help me realize that the way I processed information wasn't necessarily the way the person standing next to me processed information. And in fact, if a person is more dominant in another characteristic than I was, that my communication with that person could literally be the incorrect communication for that person. And hence why some of the conflicts and challenges happen is because we don't understand that we process it predominantly one way or another. It becomes even a bit more complicated to realize that how we process information internally can be in a different dominance, auditory, visual, or kinesthetic, than the way we take in our communication or information externally, which could have a different predominance of auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. And if I can explain this, more from my personal experience, how this works, maybe it will help people understand, is that as I started to...
I'll try and work out how I do it while you're doing it.
Yeah, good. We'll come back to you. We'll find out how you are after I share my experience of it, is that I realized when I started to notice it, that I was really, of these three categories, visually an external processor. In other words, wherever I would go, I would look at things. I could take in tremendous amounts of information just by the visual context that I was observing. And yet, it occurred to me as I started to ask myself, well, I'm taking in all this information visually, but when I'm in with my thoughts, I wanted to say listening with my thoughts, but that's the giveaway. I started to realize that my internal processing, I tended to hear my thoughts. In other words, I tended to hear my sentences, my words, I tended to auditorily, internally process information. At the time, I was actually fortunate to be around some people that understood these, and in the exploration, observation, I started to notice another gentleman that I was working with and collaborating with at the time. When we would do things out and go to a store or something, that I would take in everything visually, but he would actually take in everything from an auditory standpoint. So I asked him one day, well, when you go through a store, what's your experience? And he says, well, I hear everything. He said, I hear the engine noises. He says, if there's a strong sound that is very uncomfortable, he has to leave because it's that intense for him, because he took all of his information from an auditory perspective. So, well, when you're just in your own contemplations and when you're focusing on your thoughts internally, what do you experience? And he said he saw them. He would see geometric shapes. He would see images and pictures. He would see literally sentences and equations and all kinds of things. But he processed internally from a visual standpoint. So his external predominance was auditory. His internal predominance was visual. Whereas mine externally was visual and my predominant internal was more auditory. And again, we really process through all three. It's just that we tend to strengthen or have a strength in one over another. And ideally, I would say, and this has been my exploration and desire, is to bring greater balance into my life by balancing all three of them externally and internally, not trying to make them match up specifically, not trying to take a visual perspective that's innate outside and then make myself somehow force myself into a visual perspective of processing, but rather I tend to take more time now to not only notice when I'm out and about in the physical world, to notice things visually, but I strive to focus on listening to the sounds that are around, and then also add my actual presence. As we've talked about this present moment. I strive to, when I'm out and about, to be more present with my experiences. Touch them, feel them, sense them more than just taking them out all visually, because it's a much richer experience. Our communication opens up in vast ways when we can actually bring greater balance into our communication interactive process. And likewise, internally, I tend to now, where I still hear my thoughts, I also then strive to bring in some visualization. I actually will begin to take time to contemplate and visualize images and pictures and kind of strengthen that aspect in me. And then I've also noticed, and perhaps easier than I did move into visualization, internalizer processing, I started to notice as I was hearing my thoughts, I was also feeling, sensing, one could even say intuiting, having a connection with the feeling of my processing, which was much more kinesthetic. So over the last so many years, I've brought greater balance, and that is my hope by even bringing up this processing method, is that we need to first understand that we process differently, and that will help us understand that our communication may be different with other people. That it's not always just the words we say, it's how we present them, how we present ourselves, and then how other people receive that if they're processing with a different strength than we are. This idea of self-discovery is that if we can discover how we process auditory, visual, kinesthetic, internal, and external, sounds a bit complicated, but really isn't, because once you get the hang of it, you start to naturally bring balance. Just by recognizing these different aspects, we actually bring more balance. But it has been profoundly important for me because it has helped my inner and external communication process. So with that explanation, do you have now maybe a little bit different formula of how you process externally and internally?
Well, not that I wasn't listening to you, but whilst you were talking, I was wondering what happens when I go into a store. And it's true that I don't listen. I mean, I'm always being told I don't listen anyway. And I think visually, I actually find it overwhelming to go into a store if I'm, there's so many things to see. So I tend not to use a lot of visual cues, I think. And probably what I'm doing is deciding whether I feel comfortable in the store, including how much time I've got, how quickly do I need to get in and out, make decisions, this sort of thing. When I'm buying food, I'll consider what I'd like to buy to spoil myself a bit with, what I need to buy to stay healthy, so that I look good and feel good, and I'm thinking that I must be your kinesthetic sense, probably the feeling of I suppose just sort of feeling how I feel in the situation, what it does to me, whether if I can't afford something, how does it make me feel? If I'd like something but I know that it's not good for me, a feeling comes over me and tells me. So I think it's got to be kinesthetic in that kind of situation. And I must
So
admit,
really,
I
an
hadn't
external,
really thought.
external and internal, you really tend to feel your way through external experiences, and then also when you're going through your own contemplation process, you're not really so much hearing your thoughts or seeing your thoughts uh, manifested that way so much as you're really feeling how it feels to you collectively, internally too. Which is also certainly, I mean, just because I'm auditory in one way and visual in another way, or was more so, more predominance, there can also be auditory, visual, and certainly kinesthetic and kinesthetic, which, given the conversation, then perhaps would also help you understand when at times, your style of inner and external communication both being kinesthetic, that if you're around a visual person, if they're one to take in visually, they may not pick up on your presentation of being more of a touchy feely. They may not, or if you're being more kinesthetic and not necessarily verbalizing, they may not connect with your communication because they're auditory, and they're looking for some kind of a sense of sound emanating. So this is why I share this auditory, visual, and kinesthetic as a contemplation, because it helps us understand that there are far greater mechanisms going on, and they are unique to each of us. Now, the great thing is that we all have all three in each case. It's just that one will be tendent to be predominant both internally and externally. And I think if we understand it in ourselves, like if we can recognize that we're more kinesthetic internally and externally, then just that recognition, perhaps the next time you go out, you might be able to stand there and observe in a store, how somebody else will, go through that store seemingly highly visual. Or you might notice somebody else that seems to be connected in a very auditory way. And then that will begin to help you realize just how we all communicate in slightly different ways.
Well, if I could just, it reminds me of a situation I was in a few years ago when, and I think this suggests that actually externally I communicate more visually, because I am conscious of what people see when they see me. And on this particular occasion, I just had my hair cut, and I'd had it cut very, very, very short. I'd never had it cut short like that before. I mean, really, really short. And I just wanted to find out what I looked like, with very, very short hair, and how people reacted to me. And I went from the hairdressers into the local supermarket. And as I was walking around, I began to be aware that people weren't looking at me. It was like people were seeing me in a completely different light from the way that they would normally see me. It was a complete revelation to me. And so that was an instance where I was very aware of how my appearance causes people to relate to me in a way that I hadn't really realized before. I mean, whether it's good or bad, I don't know. But the fact was, it was different. So clearly, the way that I was presenting myself was having one effect, and it could have been completely different if I'd chosen it to be.
Well, that actually sets up the next stage, because we could obviously explore the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic to great detail, and yet this is actually a perfect way to introduce the idea of communication in a broader sense, understanding these three elements, but actually looking at contemplating the whole communication process, because again, there's an internal and an external communication process, and they are totally interrelated. It's just, again, most people have been externally focused, and we've even said, kind of unawakened, not paying attention, not necessarily conscious of their verbal styles, their communicative styles, their physical, what it is, the actions and stuff. People are just so on about being what they think is themselves that they tend not to really understand that everything they are is a presence, and that presence is a combination of all their thoughts and all their feelings, all their hopes, all their dreams, all their desires, all their sorrows. I mean, communication is who we are. The whole reason we communicate is to express ourselves. And this communication process is, this internal and external synergistic aspect of us that is a communication. We're like a broadcast station. It really comes back to that understanding of our thoughts and feelings as being kind of that beginning point, because how we think and feel about ourselves is what we communicate to the world around us. And then, of course, what we communicate to the world around us gets reinforced back into our thoughts and feelings. And I think the communication piece, which is so, one could even say like the whole purpose of being, we are just one big communication process, because we're wanting to share and convey how we're thinking, how we're feeling, what we're experiencing. And we do that in so many obvious and extraordinarily subtle ways that, we're so into the communication without realizing our impact. And many times the negative impact, the destructive impact, because we're broadcasting wherever we are at that particular moment. So communication is really such an incredibly important aspect of love to understand, and part of the self-discovery process, because if we don't understand how we're communicating with ourselves, we really are probably not going to understand how we're communicating with others. And what you were saying a moment ago with your example is that part of what you were looking for was you were choosing something different internally. You're communicating something different internally, that you wanted to have a different type of experience. In this case, with short hair, you were also looking for a response by communicating through your physical body. I mean, it was a thought and a feeling creating the short hair, because you had to have the desire, the idea that you wanted short hair, you wanted to have, or had to have the desire to have the short hair to get the haircut. And then you wanted to take it out as a communication style that somehow you were communicating to people that you were wanting to be different. Whatever that represented to you, what the short hair might have represented to you at the time, youth, masculinity, there's, who knows particularly what that driving focus was in order for you to want to have that type of experience. But then you were also communicating with the world that you were wanting to show that you weren't just this one person. Mm-hmm. You wanted to show multiple facets of yourself, multiple aspects of yourself. And that really is this ongoing, constant mechanism. For the infinite number of thoughts we have infinite number of desires, we have infinite numbers of ways of communicating. The beginning point, the self-discovery point, is we can learn from our external communication. Absolutely, we will. But we begin within. We begin by noticing our thoughts and feelings and beginning to understand what types of thoughts and feelings we're having. So if we have, like in my case, I became aware of an inner critic, an inner part of me that did not feel, for example, strong and courageous in, say, more athletic ways or more physical ways. And I realized that I would often tell myself, "Oh, you're a klutz." Every time I would trip on something, I would, say, "Oh, you klutz," or I'd make some kind of a thought or a feeling that was derogatory to myself. I mean, literally criticizing myself. Nobody around, no consequence to anyone else, but simply because I fumbled on something, I would give myself kind of an inner slap, an inner, hit with an idea that, oh, you just don't have that prowess, you don't have that strength or that capability. Well, all I did was I constantly reaffirmed this part of my life. So in this inner beginning awakening, this inner discovery, I started to pay attention to that. Well, why do I do that? Just because I trip on something, or just because I don't have what I think is, the physical ability to do something a certain way, doesn't mean that A, I can't get there if I were to put my attention upon it and actually train myself and condition myself to do it. And B, what's the point of actually putting myself down for something that is simply just an aspect of me, a very trivial aspect of me. So in this initial stage, this was one of the very initial parts of my discovery, was like, wow, this inner critic, that every time I did something that was not as bold and as brazen as somebody who, has lived their life training in something, that I would consider, a strength, didn't mean that I was in a position where I needed to criticize. That, in fact, if I released the criticism, that I would actually begin to change my reality. In fact, that's exactly what happened. When I stopped criticizing myself for not having the abilities, the physical abilities that I thought I should have compared to everyone else, again, externalizing, um, I started to notice that there was this level of confidence that began to appear. When I stopped dropping the labels, the inner critic nature of myself to myself, I naturally began to unfold differently. I found more strength and more courage and more physical prowess, and I found myself being able to do things that I had not been able to do. Well, little did I know it was my own obstacles, my own criticisms that were literally holding me back, my own limitations, my own belief systems, my own cultural impression that I had allowed, the suggestions that I allowed, that I reinforced. When I stopped reinforcing the negative aspect and started enforcing and applying and affirming my ability, my capability, lo and behold, it started to blossom. So I used this as a beginning point to really start to look at all these other areas where I was communicating internally with myself, and that can be both an inner feeling dialogue, it can be also a thought dialogue, it can also be just the way we treat ourselves. And you kind of hinted to this too, like when you're in the store, you're saying, what do I do that can spoil me? What can I do to nurture me is really the better way of saying that. Because spoil has a way of having a negative connotation, but if you take that same approach and you start affirming what can I do to nurture me, then that nurturing aspect will most probably be something that is a blend of something that is healthy, as you mentioned, and something that is good for you, and something also that would bring you joy, which would be a bit more decadent than you would normally allow yourself to have. Very different way of communicating to self. In other words, the old ways are judgment, right, wrong, good, bad. And as we've already explored previously in other videos, we've talked about positive, negative. Negative isn't bad. It's simply something that's showing us that we have a more positive way of looking at life. So rather than looking at everything right or wrong, good or bad, we can say, how can I make a wiser choice? How can I make a more affirming choice? That really doesn't imply good or bad. It simply implies that, we do know what's generally better for us, and in a process that continuously improves. So this inner dialogue, this inner communication, this inner way we treat ourselves, this inner way we criticize ourselves, this inner way we nurture ourselves, this is all part of the self-discovery process and the communication. And in fact, we'll see that this communication, as we begin to communicate differently with ourselves inwardly, we begin to communicate differently externally, because what we have within we give out, what we give out we get back. So we're going to communicate according to the way we are inside, and that is a huge cue to all of us right now to recognize that when we start to pay attention to ourselves, we'll also start to pay attention to the way other people communicate with us, and you'll have almost an instant intuitive understanding of where people are coming from internally just by listening to how they describe their lives or how they act out their lives, because they're communicating too. And now all of a sudden we have an inside intuitive awareness not only of ourselves, but we have an intuitive link to understanding where people are coming from, whether they're coming from confidence or fear, doubt or grief or sorrow, because they will reveal themselves, because their inner dialogue is driving their external communication too.
So if we start from how we're communicating ourselves, I suppose we can look back through our lives and see very, very clear cues. For example, I'm not a good thinker. I don't use my head at all. And when I was at school, I wasn't good at school. I wasn't good with exams, anything like that. And in fact, I decided very early on that I wasn't going to try to compete through exams. I was just going to be. I wanted to be a loving person, and I wanted other people to love and that sort of thing. And then I went in for hotel management as a career. Now, hotel management involves giving people a good time, making them feel very comfortable, giving them an experience they wouldn't normally have in their day-to-day lives, giving them wonderful food, giving them physical comfort, nice surroundings. And I was brilliant at that. People used to say I was born for it, because I was able to create that kind of atmosphere. Now that's a clear clue, isn't it? That's the preference. And I suppose if we look back through our lives, we can see all sorts of indications like that, that's how we've lived our life. But are you saying that we should then be looking for better balance, or maximizing the way that we communicate?
I would say we more want to understand ourselves, because by understanding who we are now, discovering more of who we are, not only will we understand who we were and many of the things that we do carry as baggage, emotional baggage, things that where we didn't feel we met the mark, like if you didn't feel like you were a good student with exams because you weren't necessarily a good thinker, we can begin to realize that we are still good thinkers, that the isolated expression isn't who you are, that you're much bigger, much richer, much grander. And in fact, part of the challenge we have, and one of the reasons why we do want to seek greater balance in our inner wisdom and our inner understanding, is that if you take in that the vast majority of us, and I certainly am included in that, for a very long time, wholly unaware of my communication style, and yet being affected and affecting others constantly with my communication style, then a whole bunch of our communication doesn't go well. In other words, we have a lot of unfortunate, unhappy experiences because we're not communicating well with ourselves, and we're reinforcing, our limiting thinking and our critical thinking, and then we're expressing that externally, and therefore limiting other people and criticizing other people. And if you think about it from a kind of an unawakened, unconscious state, that there's a whole lot of bumping into each other, and a fair amount of unpleasant experiences. Had the time period when you were taking exams, if exams would have been more aligned with the whole nature, you perhaps would have not only felt comfortable with your ability that you eventually found as a strength to share yourself in greater love, you would have also perhaps been made more aware of how to think in a greater balance, or how your thoughts were part of the process already, and that you would have a very confident current day presentation, understanding, feeling towards the way you were in your childhood, rather than thinking that that was a negative or a mistake, or that somehow you have not been a good thinker. This is not true. You've been thinking all along. It's not a predominant part of your expression. And in fact, the whole idea is, as you said, sharing your love. You found ways to express yourself that wasn't just involved in the limitation of thoughts, which you didn't want to be limited by that. You wanted to express yourself with a greater thought and feeling. So there's not in our old business sense, because I come from that business model, there isn't a perfect communication. There isn't a goal to strive for and be the best communicator ever. It's really about the whole discovery process of understanding who we are and how we look at life, and the fact that we have choice, as we mentioned in the previous video, that we can choose to look at life differently. We can choose to look at ourselves differently. We can choose to interact with people differently. And if we begin that process individually, then there will be a little less bumping into each other, a little less challenge, because we will be clearer with ourselves and we'll be clearer with those around us. And we will begin to encourage people to understand their level of communication, and we'll be more accepting of things that we weren't necessarily accepting of. So this isn't so much about, improving the perfect communication style, because that will never be, because we're constantly unfolding and evolving. This is more about truly a balance in our understanding and recognizing it. And even as you spoke, I was thinking of the whole notion of forgiveness popping up here too, because we do carry a lot of baggage from the yesterdays. And just simply by communicating that sense of feeling of forgiveness, that's where I was. I didn't know better. I didn't know I wasn't communicating well. I didn't know anything about communication. When I started to become aware that my communication was potent inside and outside, then I had something. This is part of the internal power. I now had something that I could actually work with more consciously. And of course, there's a responsibility when we're unconscious of our actions. There's responsibility when we're conscious of them. Now I could bring more of the responsibility into me and actually actively work inwardly and externally to improve, expand, to communicate with greater love, greater ease, greater present moment, this physical, emotional, mental, spiritual connection that we talk about in this present moment. When we're really more and more aligned, and again, it's not a day in time where we'll get to that perfect alignment. It's an unfolding. We keep expressing more of ourselves, and we keep blossoming more from that center point, but we're no longer just a product of our outer physical experience. We're now a part of all of it. And that's really where the communication becomes, again, I use the word so rich, it's so fulfilling, because now our improvement in communication allows us to experience other people's communication so vastly differently, because we're not judgmental. We're not judgmental with ourselves. We're not judgmental with others. We start looking for the similarities. We start literally bringing about a whole new paradigm of understanding, because we're coming from a truer sense of communication, not an externalized sense of non-action with our communication. Because that really is where a lot of us are. How many of us have really paid any attention to the type of communication we're having? Or like I like to say, I often put this, stand there and talk to somebody, and you say, I'm totally open to what you're saying. Well, what kind of, communication style is that? If you're putting that, it's like closed off, And I love showing that, because how often do we do that unconsciously? Literally stand before somebody, a friend, so close associate said, I'm listening, but there's this huge barrier that says, I'm not listening. That's what we want to become conscious of. That's what we want to discover in ourselves, and it will be unique for all of us. So we can't imply, as we already said, the auditory, visual, kinesthetic. Assuming that everybody communicates the same way is the initial wrong assumption. We want to look at how can we expand our understanding? How can we communicate with ourselves, with nature? How can we communicate with ourselves and ourselves? How can we communicate by listening? Truly listening. That's a style of communication. It's not necessarily verbal or physical, but we're listening. We're actually taking action, and we're communicating the fact that we're actively listening. These are all these components of communication that really most of us have been oblivious to. And I think it's important for us to pay attention to all of these beautiful pieces that make our whole lives that much more expressive and more interesting and more effective, literally.
So it's more a case of becoming more aware of how we communicate externally and externally, and also how other people appear to communicate internally and externally. I suppose you're not suggesting. Are you suggesting changing something, or is it that the awareness itself will change the way that you communicate?
Well, the awareness itself will make us aware that we have choice. So certainly, you could continue to go through life by your example of, realizing that you weren't great at exams may have been a truism based on that circumstance. But if you hold any kind of judgment that you were somehow less than then, and you still hold a perception that you're less than now as a result of that, like your lack of, your perceived lack of thinking over all these years has somehow made you less of a person, then that would be something that you could consider evolving, changing, just simply by being aware of it. If you keep it where it was, then it still affects you perhaps in a less than positive way. If you can actually forgive it, release it, realize that where you were, that's how you knew how to approach life. You now have, based on this conversation alone, a whole bunch of new awarenesses that you can incorporate that will help you better understand that particular time period. If you were more kinesthetic and the presentation was more visual, if you weren't being taught from a kinesthetic standpoint, then you weren't really absorbing the material in the ways that were common and natural for you. And this is one of the challenges with a lot of our schooling and our education system. It doesn't incorporate the multiple styles that people use. And some people will show poor tendencies in school, and it really has nothing to do with their ability to grasp information and work with it and learn from it. It has to do with the fact that they're not connecting to the way it's being presented. And there are some educational institutions that are becoming aware of this, and they're beginning to make more holistic approaches. That it's not all logical. It's not all just thought, that we need to bring in experiential and auditory experiences along with the visual. Well, that wasn't there then. So would you continue to carry on with an inner critical aspect of yourself, an inner criticism that you were not a good thinker? Or can you actually right now embrace I am a good thinker. Of course, I make good decisions. I make good choices. I do pay attention to my thoughts. I do think about a lot of things, and I do use my thoughts to create more of the type of world that I choose to have. That's when you begin to affect change because you're saying, I'm aware of it and I'm choosing a broader, bigger perspective. You're allowing in more of you to be in the present moment than just this inner limited aspect. That is a choice. And in fact, we have to do something in the sense that that the change we make is by recognizing this was limiting and now I'm going to choose something more unlimited. So there is an active interaction with that. So yes, there's something you can do. You don't have to, but there is something you can do, and that's the choice piece. Being aware of it and leaving it where it is, man, if it was a good experience and you're aware that it was a good experience, of course you would just embrace that. But if there's an inner critical aspect or an inner fear or an inner doubt or an inner guilt or an inner worry or an inner shame related to those previous experiences or ways of looking at it, you have something that you didn't have before. In this present moment, you can change it because you're physical, emotionally, and mentally and spiritually whole. Can't change yesterday, can't change tomorrow, but right now you can choose to look at an experience differently. You can forgive it, release it, detach from it, evolve it, transmute it. I mean, you noticed over all our conversations that I never give one specific explanation because I'm striving to show people that their way is best for them. Mm-hmm. The wisdom, the universal aspect, is universal to all of us, but it's up to the individual to say, well, I choose to take this higher. It's not up to me to say what that looks like or what it sounds like or what it would be, but I'm simply suggesting that there is choice, and that choice can be taken if a person chooses to take it. They can forgive if they choose to forgive. If they don't, they'll continue to create experiences that will reaffirm that aspect until perhaps someday they are ready to let it go. And that's also okay. So the idea that there is something you can do, yes, you can do it. What is it you're doing? Well, it may be a physical act. You may take the arms like this and then drop them the next time you're in a conversation. That's a physical change you can make. It started with the awareness. Mm-hmm. And then it's saying, I really am open to what the other person is saying. That's a very different way of communicating. And then it allows communication with the other person to improve because they're going to register this blocked off energy and they're going to feel very inwardly, whether they can express themselves or not, they are on some level aware that the communication isn't going through effectively. We're the point in ourselves where we can begin to affect change. We can't change the other people. We have no desire to, no need to, no want to. Mm-hmm. We can evolve, expand our understanding. And that's the purpose of this self-discovery. Not everybody's going to go through a self-discovery process at this point. Those that are attracted to this understanding are probably already well into their self-discovery process. And these are just ways to help them expand the understanding.
And we are talking more about self-discovery than about maximizing our potential here, I think. So that it's really helpful to become aware of how we are. In this instance, how we communicate internally and externally. And as we move through the doors and we finally come to the one that says unconditional love, and our relationships with others are on the basis of unconditional love. When it comes to communicating, I suppose the awareness of how other people do their communicating is actually a crucial part of the relationship that one has with them, isn't it? I mean, for example, regarding the way that I communicate, it doesn't concern me too much that I don't use my mind, as much as, obviously I do use my mind, but I get very impatient with the need to use my mind. For example, with a new piece of computer software, the expression is, it does my head in. I don't like having to go through the process of learning all the ins and outs of computer software, but I love being able to use computer software and produce the results with it. And that would be especially when there's something creative that I can do with it. Now, if I'm working with someone who is very good at understanding the software, but perhaps not so good with the creative side of it, then my awareness of the way that I communicate and the way that they communicate makes for a much better working relationship.
And I would add to that, as you said, the unconditional love with others, the relationship, it still all begins with ourselves. So if you're at peace with yourself, if you're okay with your style of communicating, the style of thinking, if you're okay with yourself, you will naturally communicate that to the people around you, and they will feel your comfortableness with yourself. And then they're going to feel more comfortable with what they're good at, and they're going to be able to express themselves more easily because they're going to be more at peace with themselves because you're more at peace with yourself. Mm-hmm. That's how we begin to affect real change, because we're allowing everybody to be right where they are, because we're allowing ourselves to be right where we are. And, you know, all this self-discovery, you make an interesting point, is not about maximizing our potential. It's about discovering ourselves. And there's a paradox in this, because when we do actually discover more of ourselves, we are maximizing our potential. Mm-hmm. What you're kind of indicating is that we have been conditioned, especially those of us in more of a Western world, and I'm sure, you know, culturally everywhere on the planet, there's a conditioning to quantitative results. And what we're talking about is qualitative results, or qualitative experiences is better, you know, because there's no result. There's simply greater and greater expression. And this is a wonderful point to recognize that we aren't trying to get to our greatest potential, because who are we comparing our potential to? We're simply wanting to be more love. And what does that mean? Most of us have never had an experience of being more love because we've been so conditioned to be less than love. We've been conditioned to live by fear, by doubt, by guilt, by worry, by shame. I mean, that's the strongest conditioning, you know, on our planet. To actually find out what we're capable with openness and peacefulness and lovingness and wisdom, inner intuition, you know, really honing all these abilities that we have that have been quite suppressed by ourselves, by conditioning, by suggestions, by time, by experiences, by family, by community, by culture. Releasing those things as a way to allow ourselves to be more of who we are, that allows tremendous diversity with a common bond. The common bond is we will recognize each other. We'll recognize the potential in each other because we recognize our own, and we will draw potential out of one another because we're drawing the potential out of ourselves already. So yes, I mean, you're making a great presentation of understanding that just by you expanding, I would say improving, but that's again almost a qualitative or quantitative issue. By your improving your self with yourself, by you being okay with your who you are, you will naturally extend that kind of communication, whether it ever comes out verbally or whether it comes out as an action, whether it comes out as a feeling that you're sharing with people that makes them feel more comfortable, then whatever they're good at will be expanded. You know, and that's how we affirm ourselves and affirm each other, and how we expand this in a very positive sense of communication very quickly. We're even finding some of that now in this day and age with our telecommunications that you mentioned early on. You know, communication just isn't about cell phones. And yet there's an irony to that, because our ability to communicate almost spontaneously, instantaneously, wherever we are, and with the social networks and the various things that we have at our hands and our use worldwide, we are, in a sense, all learning to communicate differently, because now we're getting more intimate and more connected on not only a cultural level within our own community, but literally multicultural level globally. And it's profoundly changing the style of communication and the wisdom and the awareness, and people are becoming much more aware of each other and the nuances of how we communicate differently. So there is already kind of a global discovery process going on. Mm-hmm. And maybe if we can bring it more internal, we can expand and express that communication even more rapidly by being more honest with ourselves, being more vulnerable with ourselves, having greater dignity and integrity with ourselves, because all of these things will be expressed externally to others, and then that will encourage others to come from similar places.
Mm. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's good. So that aspect is really the key then to communications. What we've been talking about today, the way we communicate internally and externally.
You know, if we're doing something or not doing something, because it can also be a non-physical action. If we, for whatever reason, choose not to show up at an appointment that we've agreed upon, we're communicating by the lack of our presence.
Mm-hmm.
And on some level, we've made a decision not to honor that obligation that we'd afforded, you know, assuming, you know, nothing has happened to us. We've just simply chosen not to do something and then not communicated why we weren't doing it. Communication runs on the non-physical also, you know, so, you know, not showing up is a form of communication. So, you know, the whole idea here is to expand our understanding of all the many ways, the many facets, the synthesis of all these aspects coming together as communication as a broad label. But there's so many pieces to it, and we just need to be aware that there are lots of pieces to it, and that we are broadcasting all the time, we're receiving all the time, and that constant ongoing communication internally and externally, the more aware we are, present we are with it, the greater we can make choices differently to improve our internal and external communication and improve our experiences. Because isn't the goal basically to have a more joyful life? Well, we do that by becoming more aware of who we are right now.
Mm. Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Harold.
Pleasure.